Well, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Doug Dammann. I'm the Curator of Education at the Civil War Museum in Kenosha, Wisconsin. Today's program is entitled Lincoln and the Election of 1860. One of the things that we were doing this election season was looking at the day-to-day activities of Abraham Lincoln between his time when he was the Republican nominee for the presidency in 1860 up until the time of the election in early November. And we were putting together throughout the course of the summer Facebook posts connected to the Lincoln campaign, what Lincoln was doing down in Springfield throughout the summer and early fall. And we were creating Facebook posts for these. And I thought it might be an interesting presentation to kind of combine some of those Facebook posts into a PowerPoint presentation and present them here. Much of the information that I was able to glean in a very helpful source for a lot of the daily occurrences in Lincoln's life at this time comes to us from a book entitled Lincoln Day by Day, a chronology 1809 to 1865, which is an incredible resource for providing the day-to-day activities of Lincoln throughout his entire life. But today we're going to consider only the events from May 18th, 1860 up until the election in early November of 1860. So it's not a complete chronology, but I did find some interesting occurrences that happened throughout that time frame, and I thought I'd share them with you today. So let's start with the nomination. Lincoln was nominated by the Republican Party on May 18th, 1860 in Chicago at a building called the Wigwam. Now, Lincoln was not present at that nomination. Some of his political handlers and friends were there, stumping for him and promoting candidate Lincoln for the office, but Lincoln himself was not there. And in fact, they encouraged him not to show. So in contrast that with today, with modern Democratic or Republican conventions where the candidate is there, that candidate who was ever the nominee for that party, often the kind of the culminating event of the convention is a speech made by that candidate. So Lincoln wasn't even in Chicago at that time to receive the nomination. But a group of Republicans did travel south to Lincoln's hometown, Springfield, Illinois, to offer him the nomination the following day. And so they arrived in Springfield on May 19th, 1860, and they met with Lincoln in his home on 8th and Jackson Streets. And at that meeting, Lincoln received formal notice of his nomination by the Republican leaders. The notification committee arrived late in the afternoon and called on Lincoln at his home at 8 p.m. He received them in their north parlor of the home, and then the committee adjourned to the south parlor, where they met Mrs. Lincoln. Now, there are various accounts of that evening that differ in some minor points. One thing that they all agreed on, though, and this is an interesting point, is that Lincoln declined to provide any sort of alcoholic drink or liquor at that occasion, to celebrate the occasion. And the story goes that Lincoln, after the formal acceptance of the nomination, he told those assembled it would be good manners if he offered them something to drink. He sent the gentleman into a second room to meet Mrs. Lincoln, and in the library of his home, he set up a table with a pitcher of water and glasses. Some of his friends suggested that some stronger entertainment, quote unquote, should be provided, and that they would be happy to go out and provide it. But Lincoln replied, and this is a direct quote from him, "I must respectfully decline your offer. I have no liquor in my house and have never been in the habit of entertaining my friends in that way. I cannot permit my friends to do for me what I will not myself do." Several weeks later, the question persisted. Why did he not provide alcoholic beverages to the committee? Must have been talked about. It must have been discussed through Republican channels. And Lincoln provided another response in a letter to a Mr. Mason Haight of California. In that letter, he wrote, Having kept house 16 years and having never held the cup to the lips of my friends there, my judgment was that I should not, in my new position, change my habit in this respect. So it's a little known, a little discussed footnote in the history of this event, but it seems to have taken on a bit of a life of its own, in that Lincoln had to defend himself in this letter. After his death, after his time in the White House, inquiries were made to his son Robert, as well to his private secretaries John Hay and John Nicolay, about Lincoln's drinking habits. Robert replied in private correspondence that he remembered his father would have the occasional sip of wine with dinner, but that was about it. Hay and Nicolay responded that they had never seen Lincoln in the habit of drinking whiskey or anything of the nature, so that they were completely, had never seen that before in their reply. Lincoln's own response was that he had never acquired the taste for alcohol, and it made him feel, quote, flabby and undone. I think we certainly take for granted in modern politics the physical appearance of our candidates. I don't think you'd be able to find an American citizen, or pretty much anyone probably in North America, who don't know what Donald Trump or Joe Biden look like, what their physical appearance is. Now, that wasn't the case for candidate Lincoln in the summer of 1860. It's written that the majority of the American public at that time didn't have a clue as to what Lincoln's physical appearance was. What did he look like? To help fix that, the Republican Party commissioned Thomas Hicks, an artist, to come from New York to paint a portrait of Lincoln and to use that picture and that likeness to represent Lincoln in the upcoming campaign. Now, Hicks arrived in Springfield in early June with a letter of introduction from New York newspaperman Charles Dana. The letter was addressed to William Herndon, Lincoln's law partner. So Herndon was then in turn going to introduce Hicks to Lincoln. He did so, and Lincoln agreed to sit for Hicks's portrait. The sittings took place between 8 and 9 a.m. each day in early June from about June 12th, and finished work was done and introduced around June 14th. And the sittings took place in Lincoln's temporary campaign headquarters, the office that he held in the state capitol. What's interesting is that Hicks was a Republican in politics before coming to meet with Lincoln. He was, however, a pro-William Seward supporter prior to the convention. So much so that it was written that Hicks had produced a painting of Seward on a silk banner that was to be unfurled upon Seward's nomination in Chicago. It was thought to be by many parties, people within the Republican Party, that it was a foregone conclusion that Seward would win the nomination. So Hicks was the one that produced that banner. Lincoln quickly won over Hicks, and Hicks was pretty confident after his sittings with Lincoln, his interaction with Lincoln there in June, that Lincoln would become the next president of the United States. Lincoln viewed the finished portrait and approved, as did several of his close friends and associates in Springfield. In order to produce for mass consumption, the portrait was made into a lithograph by a New York company. And today, the original work by Hicks still exists. It's now part of the collection of the Chicago Historical Society. Lincoln himself said of the portrait that Hicks did, there you can see it on the left in the slide, that the portrait would give the people of the East a correct view of how I look at home. I think the picture has a somewhat pleasanter expression than I usually have, but that, perhaps, is not an objection. A second artist was dispatched to Springfield in August of 1860 to do another likeness of Lincoln to, again, help with the campaign. Judge John Reed of Philadelphia commissioned John Henry Brown to come to Springfield. He paid him $300 to make the painting because Judge Brown was so disgusted by the caricatures of Lincoln that he was seeing in Eastern newspapers. Brown arrived in Springfield with kind of low expectations of Lincoln. In fact, he was worried that his subject might be too ugly for him to make a decent portrait. Though the portrait itself was somewhat unique in that it was a small miniature portrait painted on an ivory background. Brown first met Lincoln on August 13th, and Lincoln agreed to sit for him for the miniature portrait. The two men went to a local photographic studio in Springfield, where a half a dozen ambrotypes of Lincoln were made. So Brown was going to use the ambrotypes as the basis for much of his work. In addition to those, Lincoln sat for Brown 5 times. Brown wrote in his journal what he thought of Lincoln. He came to admire him very much as a result of this work, even though he stated that he did not agree with candidate Lincoln's politics. Brown left a keen insight into Lincoln's appearance and character. Quote, "There are so many hard lines in his face that it becomes a mask of the inner man. His true character only shines out when it shines out in an animated conversation or when telling an amusing tale, of which he is very fond. He is said to be a homely man. I do not think so." Close quote. Both Mr. and Mrs. Lincoln wrote letters to Brown after the painting was finished, expressing their great satisfaction with the work. And later on, a metal engraving was made of the miniature so that it could be sold and mass-produced as part of the 1860 presidential campaign for Lincoln. The original portrait that Brown did, the miniature on ivory, now resides at the National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C. Sickness. Illness swept through the Lincoln family in early July of 1860. And you can only imagine the worry and the problematic nature of this illness as it came through the Lincoln household for the children and also for candidate Lincoln. On July 2nd, 1860, the Chicago Tribune reported that Lincoln's son, Willie, who was age 9, was seriously ill with a disease. It turned out to be scarlet fever. In a letter dated July 4th, Lincoln told a friend that he too was not feeling well and that he worried that he was suffering from the same disease. Lincoln wrote, "I have a headache and a sore throat upon me now, inducing me to suspect that I have an inferior type of the same thing, Willie's scarlet fever diagnosis." Scarlet fever was a very dangerous but common affliction amongst children at that time. Between 1820 and 1880, there was a world pandemic of the disease. Physicians became very well versed at diagnosing the disease by the presence of the following symptoms: a red rash over the skin, a sore throat, fever, inflammation of the lymph nodes, and abscessing of the throat and tonsils. The disease was caused by bacteria. And once the onset of symptoms hit the patient, the sore throat and the fever, the infection could progress very quickly, and children in the 19th century were known to die within the initial diagnosis within 48 hours. The bacteria could be contracted through human contact, airborne droplets, or ingestion. So in that way, it's very similar to how people are contracting COVID-19 here in 2020. When an outbreak hit, the symptoms could vary widely, again, just like COVID-19. And those symptoms could vary widely within a population or even within the same family. Some people who had scarlet fever could remain asymptomatic but become carriers of the bacteria, while others got the acute fever and the severe tissue reactions. Thankfully for the Lincoln family, both Willie and Abraham recovered from their scarlet fever scare, and by mid-July, candidate Lincoln was back conducting the business of the campaign and receiving visitors. Vice presidential choices. You know, today it's big news when a candidate picks a running mate. And we know from this summer's campaign, the 2020 campaign, that President Trump retained his vice president from previous, Mike Pence from his previous campaigns. And Joe Biden took his time, right? It took a long time before he nominated Kamala Harris to be his vice presidential nominee. but it was ultimately his or their selection. And it's certain that the two people had met each other and had, I'm sure, a relationship before they became presidential and vice presidential candidates. Such was not the case for Lincoln and his vice presidential nominee, Hannibal Hamlin. Very interesting story about Hamlin, how he became the vice presidential nominee and how he received word that he was, in fact, the nominee. It all went down when Lincoln upset William Seward in Chicago when he became the presidential candidate. The vice presidential nomination was offered first to the Seward camp, and Lincoln really didn't have any say in the matter. The disappointed Seward men put no one forward for the nomination. Hannibal Hamlin seemed a natural choice for the position. He was moderate, but with a spotless record against slavery. He was also a friend of Seward's in the Senate, and so Hamlin won the vice presidential nomination on a second ballot at the convention. The nomination itself came as a shock to Hannibal Hamlin. He was playing cards in a Washington hotel room when he heard a racket outside the door in a corridor. Story goes, the door burst open and the room filled with excited men, led by Indiana Congressman Schuyler Colfax, who read a telegram from the Chicago Convention and addressed Hamlin as Mr. Vice President. Stunned, Hamlin decided he didn't want the offer. He declined it immediately. But Ohio Senator Ben Wade warned him that to decline the nomination would only give ammunition to the Democrats, suggesting that Hamlin was afraid to run on what he viewed as a losing ticket. Afterwards, Hamlin wrote to his wife and explained, "I neither expected or desired it, but it has been made, and as a faithful man to the cause, it leaves me no alternative but to accept it." At least, he conceded, the duties of the office would not be, quote, hard or unpleasant. So Hamlin becomes the vice presidential nominee. Now again, Lincoln didn't have much say in the matter, if any say at all. On July 18th of 1860, Lincoln wrote to Hamlin from Springfield, and this is part of the letter, quote, "It appears to me that you and I ought to be acquainted, and accordingly I write this as a sort of introduction of myself to you. You first entered the Senate during the single term I was a member of the House of Representatives, but I have no recollection that we were introduced." So imagine a presidential candidate and his vice presidential candidate today not really knowing each other, never having been formally introduced, not having a relationship, an exchange of ideas or anything like that. And in fact, it wasn't until after Lincoln and Hamlin ticket won the election that they would meet. The two would first meet face-to-face in Chicago on November 22nd, 1860. Now, Hamlin went on to become a faithful vice president for the Lincoln administration. He was consulted by Lincoln certainly early on when the composition of the cabinet was coming together. Hamlin, as a senator from Maine, was instrumental in securing a lot of the individuals from New England who became part of Lincoln's cabinet, as well as convincing William Seward to become Secretary of State. So Hamlin did provide loyal and faithful good service for Lincoln during his first term. The campaign. During the 1860 presidential campaign season, Abraham Lincoln didn't travel the country to campaign for himself. He didn't make speeches from his home. He didn't publish letters in newspapers. And in fact, political tradition considered it inappropriate for candidates to ask voters to vote for them. The candidates themselves left it up to local supporters to organize campaign events and to speak on their behalf. So one of the biggest rallies that Lincoln supporters put together occurred on August 8th, 1860 in Springfield, Illinois. At 10 a.m. that morning, a huge parade with bands, floats, marchers, you name it, began at the state capitol and traveled through the city of Springfield. The progression passed the Lincoln home on 8th and Jackson as Abraham and his family watched from the doorway. Here on the left is a photograph from that event. That afternoon, on August 8th, the Illinois State Fairgrounds hosted a huge crowd for speeches. Lincoln appeared at that rally on the fairgrounds but declined to speak. After the rally, the Springfield Journal estimated that 80,000 people crowded into Springfield that day for the festivities. As we talked about earlier, Lincoln's activities were in keeping with his inactivity campaign-wise during the summer and fall of 1860. In keeping with tradition, Lincoln stayed in Springfield and received delegations who came to meet him and to pay their respects. But he heeded the advice of the pro-Republican New York Evening Post, whose editor wished that he would, quote, make no speeches, write no letters as a candidate, enter into no pledges, write no letter, make no promises, nor give any of those kind words which men are apt to interpret into promises. And Lincoln abided by those words throughout the summer and fall. Two of the three other candidates for president who were running that summer did the same. Southern Democrat John Breckinridge gave only one speech during his campaign. John Bell said nothing beyond his party's published platform. Only Stephen A. Douglas of Illinois, the Northern Democratic candidate, broke from tradition and traveled all over the country campaigning for himself. He went from New England to the Deep South, shaking hands and making speeches. By October, however, Douglas recognized that Lincoln was likely going to win the election. His tone on the campaign trail changed a bit. He began urging people to remain loyal to the Union, reject secession, and work within the overall American political system if they wanted to make change. While Lincoln was silent, he certainly was observing what was going on politically in the country. And Lincoln kept a close eye on what Douglas was doing. He kept active in private conversation with Republican Party leaders, and Lincoln himself recognized the threat that the Douglas campaign possessed to Lincoln's candidacy. In fact, Lincoln wrote a letter on August 17th of 1860 to New York newspaper publisher and Republican Party insider Thurlow Weed. And in that letter, Lincoln stated that he was somewhat uneasy about his chances of winning New York State. Lincoln wrote, quote, "There will be the most extraordinary effort ever made to carry New York for Douglas. You and all the others who write me from your state think the effort cannot succeed, and I hope you were right. Still, it will require close watching." So candidate Lincoln was acutely aware of what Douglas was doing and the implications it had on his campaign. We've talked a lot about William H. Seward already. Interestingly enough, Seward himself made a brief stop in Springfield during the campaign season. On October 1st of 1860, Seward stopped at the Springfield train depot. He was traveling via train from St. Louis to Chicago. The train stopped in Springfield. Seward emerged from the train and spoke on the platform of the station to an estimated crowd of 2,000 to 3,000 people. Lincoln, getting word that Seward was in town, was one of those in attendance, and the two politicians greeted each other and spoke briefly. You have to remember that Seward was the frontrunner for the Republican nominee back in May at the Chicago Convention. But by October, he was campaigning for the Republican ticket and for Lincoln. Throughout September of 1860, Seward left his home in New York and traveled through the upper Midwest campaigning for Lincoln. He went through the western states of Michigan, Illinois, Indiana, Wisconsin, Iowa, Minnesota, and Kansas campaigning. Seward made stops in Detroit, Lansing, Kalamazoo, Milwaukee, Madison, St. Paul, and Dubuque, as well as a number of other smaller communities to drum up support for Lincoln and the Republican Party. We know that after Lincoln's election that Lincoln pursued Seward and asked him to become his Secretary of State in the administration. And Seward did accept and became one of Lincoln's most loyal members of and trusted advisors in the Lincoln cabinet. So an amazing meeting in October, early October of 1860 as Seward traveled through the upper Midwest. A little girl's request. On October 19th, 1860, Abraham Lincoln wrote a short letter to 11-year-old Grace Bedell of Westfield, New York. His letter was in reply to one that she had sent to him earlier in the month, suggesting that Lincoln grow a beard because, quote, your face is so thin, unquote, and all the ladies like whiskers, and they would tease their husbands to vote for you if Lincoln were to grow a beard. Lincoln's response to Grace read, Miss Grace Bedell, my dear little miss, your very agreeable letter of the 15th is received. I regret the necessity of saying I have no daughters. She had asked about his family and if he had any daughters, obviously. I have 3 sons, one 17, one 9, and one 7 years of age. They with their mother constitute my whole family. As to the whiskers, having never worn any, do you not think people would call it a silly piece of affection if I were to begin it now? Your very sincere well-wisher, A. Lincoln. Now, whether or not the famous Lincoln beard that he grew shortly thereafter, we saw the 2 campaign paintings and likenesses done in the summer show obviously a beardless candidate Lincoln. Whether or not the beard was in direct result of the letter written by Grace Bedell, or if it were for other reasons, we do know that Lincoln started growing a beard, and by the time he became President-elect Lincoln, we can see some early photographs here of Lincoln sporting his early chin whiskers. Now, different historians have suggested reasons behind Lincoln's growing of the beard. Some of them suggest that he was hiding his face because he knew he was not ready to be president. Others say it demonstrated a supreme self-confidence. This was a man who was willing to risk ridicule and unavoidable puns like old Abe is putting on hairs by growing the beard. Or possibly it hinted that President-elect Lincoln wanted to present a new face to the public, and he felt the beard gave him a more authoritative or elderly look. Or maybe it was simply out of boredom that he grew the facial hair, a new look for himself as he waited to go to Washington, D.C. and be inaugurated in March of 1861. We'll never really know, but those are some of the opinions that have been given over the years about Lincoln and his beard. I want to close the presentation with an admission by Lincoln himself about his candidacy for president and how he felt about it shortly before the election. And maybe there was some cold feet involved in this. We really don't know, but we do know that Lincoln made the following statement in a letter written October 25th of 1860. He wrote, quote, I would rather have a full term in the Senate, a place where I would feel more consciously able to discharge the duties required, and where there is more chance to make a reputation and less danger of losing it than 4 years of the presidency. I think it's a startling admission for a man who was about to become president of the United States shortly before the election. It speaks greatly to where his mind was at that particular moment. But we do know that Lincoln was elected president in November of 1860, inaugurated in 1861, and the rest, as they say, is history. So I hope you've enjoyed this brief look into some of the comings and goings of Lincoln, the Lincoln campaign, what was going on in the country politically in the summer and fall of 1860 leading up to the presidential election. We look forward to hosting additional virtual programs here at the museum, and I hope you'll join us for those as they're posted in the future on our Facebook and social media platforms. Thanks a lot. Have a great day.